Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Keynes, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast. Join us as we listen to queer classical music from around the world, talk with composers, and explore the wonderful, diverse, and growing repertoire of LGBTQ musicians.
So today, Jacob and I are really pleased to have on the show one of Australia's leading queer artists, Evan Lawson. Now, Evan's work has been described as bar-to-bar beautiful and has even been spoken in the same breath as Mahler. If that isn't enough, Evan is a renowned conductor, particularly of opera music. However, what sets Evan apart is his outspoken solidarity for First Nation and LGBT plus people, and we're really looking forward to talking with him.
Well, today we are very happy to welcome Evan Lawson all the way from Melbourne, Australia. Welcome.
Hello, g'day, as we say here.
Evan is a composer, conductor, writer of many things, musician in Australia, and we're very happy to have you here today. We're going to listen to a few things, and I'm excited to pick your brain on how you conduct and how you work through productions and ensembles. And the two things we're listening to today are so interesting in their production and in their creation and inception, and looking forward to hearing about it. But I wonder if you can tell our listeners just a bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for allowing me on the show. Very excited. So yes, my name is Evan. I'm a composer and a conductor based in Melbourne, Australia. I am 32 years of age and have been composing and conducting pretty much my whole life. So started playing music when I was 10. But I've been working as a professional musician, my entire adult life. And when I say working as a professional musician, as everyone might know, that's a very loaded term because one doesn't necessarily make my entire earnings off that. So I do also work for a lot of arts organisations here in Australia. I've done a little bit of work overseas. I've been very fortunate to have music performed all over the world. So yeah, I create art.
Which is the goal with so many people, and it's phenomenal whenever, in whatever context you're able to do it. I mean, it's everybody strives for that. That's great. I'm happy you're making art. This is good. So we have a couple things to listen to. The first one that Sammy and I had kind of talked about listening to was from Hyacinth. So maybe you can tell us a bit about this production in general, and then tell us what we're going to listen to.
Sure. So Paean from Hyacinth is a double concerto I wrote. It's actually had a few iterations. So the version you'll hear is the most recent from 2015, but I actually originally wrote it in 2012. So I say to people I am a reformed clarinetist. So I played the clarinet ever since I was 10. And when I got to uni as a composition student, I got really jealous of all the other instrumentalists playing an orchestra and doing concertos and doing all these things. So I was like, I still want to play the clarinet, and I continued with it, and I really battled with it. I'm not a clarinetist, so that's why I'm a reformed clarinetist. Anyway, I was like, I will write myself a concerto, perform it with an orchestra, and then I am never going to touch the thing again. And that is exactly what happened. So I wrote this in 2012. My best friend, Jess Fortinas, who's an incredible harpist now based in China, I wrote the harp part for her, the clarinet part for myself. Jess actually couldn't do the show, so then we actually had to fly a harpist over from Western Australia because I just couldn't find anyone to do the gig. Her name is Catherine Ashley, and she did the premiere with me. And then I revised the work and conducted it in this recording for my master's recital in conducting. Again, I wanted Jess to do it, and she happened to be in the country because she was living in Germany at the time, but she couldn't do the dates. So Catherine flew over again and did it, but Jess did play in the orchestra, and I rewrote a glockenspiel part for harp. So the harp concerto actually has two harp parts, and Jess and I still to this day laugh like, oh, remember that time I rewrote a glockenspiel part, and it also had a part for tin cans, so I made her play the tin cans in it. So you'll hear these tin can parts. That's my friend Jess.
That's a great story. Great story.
I mean, how often is there a harp in anything, and let alone two harps? That just seems
Exactly.
opulent, to be
And
honest.
tin cans as well. I mean, it's not common.
Exactly.
There's I don't know how familiar with he's an American like wind band composer, but John Mackey, who is a whole mood and vibe unto himself. But John Mackey wrote a wind band piece with I think they're trash cans filled with chains, and you have to
Cool.
like, throw them. So those percussionists have to like, because it's a fairly famous like American wind band piece. They have to either be like quite strong in general, or have to like work out before the performance for several months so that they can just lift these things and like crash them at the right times.
That's awesome. That's
I'm
so
all for
cool.
like altered percussion. This is great.
Yeah. Well, the tin cans were out of necessity because the original version was for a youth orchestra, and all they had were a set of timpanis. So
Mm.
I wanted to have a different color and some interesting percussion sounds without breaking the bank. So, a couple of old tin peaches, and it worked out really, really well. But the work, just so you're aware, if you want me to talk a little bit about the context of the piece, so a lot of my work focuses on ancient Greece. So a paean is a hymn to Apollo that was performed in ancient Greece. And hyacinth, some people might know the myth of the hyacinth flower. So Hyacinth was a beautiful young boy. He was the lover of Apollo. The West Wind was jealous of him. Apollo and the West Wind, Zephyr had, this competition and argument. And, West Wind's like, I'm a better discus thrower than you are to Apollo. And they were doing the discus thing, and the West Wind blew Apollo's discus and it hit Hyacinth. Hyacinth died, and from the blood of Hyacinth, the flower was born. So this work the harp represents Apollo, the clarinet represents Hyacinth, and the orchestra sort of represents the West Wind. So there's this kind of battle element between the three, but also aspects of like what I would call love duets between the harp and the clarinet.
Can I just ask you, because you've got a kind of a Greek thing going with some of your pieces. So I mean, you mentioned it there. Is there another reason for this? I mean, what do you find interesting, I guess, about the Greek mythology?
Sure. On a just kind of rudimentary basic level, it's just something that I've liked ever since I was a kid. The myths have always, as a kid, like watching a Disney movie and reading a book of Greek myths would have been on the same plane to me. So it was just something that I was always fascinated in. Ancient Egypt was always a fascination as a child, and fantasy kind of imagination in general. But Greek myths especially, because they're so rich in the imagery, there's a whole philosophical element of it being the cornerstone of Western thinking. But also I love this element that, ancient Greece is so heavily influenced from, Central Asia, North Africa. It has elements that are outside of European thinking. I think we often think of it as, Plato and all that. And yes, they're cornerstones of Western philosophy, but they're also strongly influenced by non-European traditions, and importantly for me, queer traditions. And that, kind of showing that gods like Apollo, who are very well known in our world, have queer aspects to those stories that have perhaps been slightly whitewashed through the Victorian era. So I kind of like the idea of re-exploring and re-engaging those queer aspects and gender aspects that are fluent through a lot of those myths.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about queer music towards the end. That's where we always end up, I think, with this. But perhaps we should listen to the first piece and then we can talk about it in more detail.
Yeah, so this is the double concerto. This is the harp and clarinet. So I have an ensemble question for you. So what is the ensemble for this? I heard, or at least I think I heard some like contrabassoon, obviously the tin cans, there's harps, there's clarinet, brass. Do you know just off the top of your head, like what's the ensemble?
Yeah, I might get this a bit wrong. It's been a few years, but it's essentially a chamber orchestra. So you've got the clarinet soloist and the harp soloist. As I said, the harp version doubling on this sort of auxiliary percussion thing, playing tin cans, and there's also passage for envelopes at the beginning, a rustling. I've got this thing in a lot of my work about rustling paper, which I find really beautiful. And then the actual kind of band, the proper band, is timpanis, a double wind section with all the second wind players doubling on auxiliary, so a coranglais, piccolo, contrabassoon, bass clarinet. And there's a passage that I specifically, I love this idea in concertos where you kind of create a cacophony with that instrument. So there's just a slight passage where it's these like, all the clarinets are just like wailing away at each other. So I love this idea of like the family, kind of all squawking at each other. Two horns, one trumpet, one trombone, and a string section and a piano, I'm pretty sure is the band. Yeah.
Okay, so it's like a pretty beefy band, yeah.
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 I must admit, when I first started listening to it, I got the recording and I started listening. I thought, God, there's something wrong with the recording. And then I realized it was actually deliberate. And then I was thinking, what is that sound? And I spent ages I must have been hours thinking, what is this thing at the beginning? And I guess it's the rustling paper.
Yeah, that's exactly
at the beginning.
Right.
And I was like, gosh, am I hearing this right? And it was, I spent ages just focused on this little bit, trying to work out what it was. It was great. It was really fascinating.
Well, Sammy, thank you. Because like, for me, that's like my goal in life. Like Ravel does this all the time, where especially if you're playing in the orchestra and you're used to the way that an orchestra sounds, you'll hear this thing. And actually Jess, the harpist who I mentioned, who I worked a lot with and we've played together a lot, would often talk about how when you do Ravel, you hear this, it might be a glockenspiel, a second trumpet, and a second oboe, like instruments that might not regularly double, and you hear this amazing color, and you go, oh my God, what was that? And so I've always tried to create those sort of colors. So thank you for saying that. That's like a little bit of a life goal right there.
And it's interesting you mentioned Ravel there, because I guess when I listened to a bit of it, it did have this feel of an impressionist piece in some ways. I mean, it was kind of, I mean, it's clearly different. I'm not trying to say it's the same sort of, the same musical genre, but it did have this feel of almost being impressionistic in the sort of soundscape it was trying to build.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I would say, especially when this piece was originally written when I was still a student, and when it was revised, like Ravel, Debussy, Stravinsky, the early Stravinsky, are always huge influences on me. Just the whole French 20th century French school of color, which really is born with Ravel, was very influential on my development. So, yeah, I mean, natural sounds and depictions of the natural world is also something that isn't always present, but often creeps into my music. This piece is especially, I guess, I like the idea that it is blurring the lines between programmatic music, descriptive music, and more abstract music. And that's often like all of my music sort of walks this line where it's at times very theatrical and it's usually narrative based. But through that, I like the idea of also creating a little bit of chaos and a little bit of the unexpected. So I think that's something you often get with Debussy is a great example where you get this like logic and depiction of things, and then a complete abstraction of the like in an impressionist painting, he then blurs the edges for you to kind of enjoy just the pure abstraction of it.
Yeah, I think the blurred edges, it kind of works in my head. It felt, and it's funny to hear you talk about like a story inception of where the piece comes from Hyacinth, and then the sound of like zephyr blowing, like the wind, and the like. It feels very like I'm being blown through the sounds, and it seems almost like maybe impulsive. Like where you end up going is just kind of where the wind has taken you. Like some of these sound things that kind of come out of nowhere, or the colors that pop up out of either from chaos to an interesting sound color, or from nothing to an interesting sound color. And when I was writing notes to chat about this, I think I wrote colorful 6 times. Like I think it just was so like bright and vibrant, and like I'm a wind person. I deal with like winds 99% of the time, and so I'm used to color because everything is inherently colorful, whether you want it to be or not. But similarly, this just sounded so like rich and colorful, and so that's like always exciting for me. That's nice.
Oh, thank you. I mean, orchestration is like the funnest thing. It's just so great and I often, for a work like this, I would write out the way I wrote this piece is I wrote out the clarinet, the harp parts, and a condensed orchestral part in a piano score version with like cues to myself, okay, this will be a flute solo or whatever. And then at a later stage, once I'd sort of perfected that draft, I would then extend it out for orchestra. And I often write, that's a way I really like writing. It's a way to write vocal music really well, because similar with a concerto, you've got a single line. You don't want to muddy that line up too much. Like if it's a clarinet and it sits in sort of the mid register, it's not that strong. So if you've got other instruments sitting in that register, it can often the clarinet has to work more, extra hard, or the singer has to work extra hard to cut through the texture. So it's actually an easier way to sort of say, okay, well, I can put the middle ground and the foreground out. So yeah, orchestration is just such a fun thing to do. It's like I say to people that it's almost a whole different process. The writing of the notes is kind of like constructing your painting, and then you're adding the color onto that. So you just think the impact of a piece can be completely different. And the interesting thing with this work is that it is the second iteration of another piece. So it is an opportunity for me to return, remove, add, and fiddle around a bit, which was a great pleasure.
So when you write this, I mean, as Jacob will tell you, I have no musical talent whatsoever. When you listen, obviously you've got this in your mind, what you want this to sound like, and you start this top level orchestration, if you like, of the basics. Do you then find yourself going, no, wait a minute, that's not what I want it to be like. I want to change that, or with the rest of it, or do you actually ending up where you think you started?
Yeah. My process is kind of like, I'm very fortunate in that ever since I began writing music, I can just sit at a desk and write music. Now, that's not to say that every note I write is a masterpiece. Absolutely not. But I can sit down and just finish page after page after page, ream after ream.
Wow.
So for me, there's this quote by Shostakovich where he said that he spends years with a piece, but he doesn't write it, and then he sits down and then he writes the work in 2 months or whatever. And that was often how he wrote a symphony. He just sat down and it just sort of came out, and there was a little bit of argy-bargy and editing and stuff, but, essentially he sat down and wrote it. I'm very similar. I'll sit down. I do a bit of pre-planning. I might do things like, I do a lot of description. So I might be like a work like Hyacinth. There's a lot of clarinet techniques that are unorthodox. So there's one moment, for instance, where the clarinetist has to get a piece of cigarette paper. So woodwind players often have cigarette paper in their case to dry the pads because you get too much saliva.
Yeah.
And one day I was experimenting with, like, if you're fingering a note and there's some of those holes open, if you bring the paper in and out, it creates this amazing buzzy sound because the paper's so light. So I wrote large sections of the piece with that in mind. So obviously I had a clear idea of the coloration of it. But often for me, I will just sit down, I start at the start, I write to the end, I rarely chop and change. And then really the kind of, I guess, that element of like craft and reevaluation happens more so when I'm in the room with the musicians. And as a conductor, that is a very different process because often I'm conducting my own work. So I can I have the authority to just be like, cut this section, add this, put that up an octave, change that. And I think like musicians love that because it's very rare to be in a classical music context where you get the opportunity to workshop. We just don't have that time, especially with an orchestra. We just don't have that. Like, it's so expensive. So, unlike, my colleagues who may be theatre writers or, where there is a kind of a, or a novelist, you have the part of the process is redrafting. We do that. But when we perform it, people expect it to be a masterpiece. And it's a lot of pressure. It's really hard. So that's a big part of my thinking. And luckily, as a conductor, I've got a lot of skills that I can like look at the page and make some of those decisions, hopefully, before I'm confronted with 150 people questioning what I'm doing.
That's an interesting. So as somebody, like, I don't write. I say I'm like a functional composer, as in if something needs to, I need like 5 more minutes of something, I will write something, but it's not my bag. But I understand the skills of a conductor, and it's interesting to hear you say, like, putting on the different hats for different purposes for the same goal, like being able to, as a conductor, understand what the composer needs, and as a composer, understand what the conductor needs, and then in both roles, understand what the ensemble needs and can make those changes. And I don't think I've really thought of it that way. And so that's really fascinating to me, that like as a composer, and it's something that is written for people on that's on their stands. You're in a rehearsal, and then as your conductor hat goes on, you can like make those workshoppy changes through the mind of a composer. That's really interesting.
And be intuitive about it.
Yeah. I always wonder if you could go back in time and listen to Bach or somebody, whether he wrote this stuff and he went, well, actually, hold on a minute, we're going to play this differently to what I wrote it down to be. And how much of it, and so that's what's kind of nice about this. You're actually, hearing it as the composer really wants you to hear it played out there, which is kind of nice about modern music, I think. Whereas, when you hear it often, older music, you're hearing it through the ears of somebody different, so it kind of has a different flavor to it. So that's what I kind of liked about this. It's kind of fun thing to listen to.
Well, the things that strike me about those observations, and what I find really interesting, and what I just feel so lucky as a creator of new music and a conductor of new music, is that, like, Jacob, you might be able to talk a bit about this, where like the overture to the Magic Flute, right? So it opens with those chords and they're paused, and conducting school, it's like you've got to think about how these chords are delivered, and Currier does it like this, and blah blah. And it is like there are treatises, there are tomes dedicated to the history of how Mozart did it. Mozart wrote it in like 10 minutes as a perfunctory, quick thing that he whipped off to just write an overture. They were not, but over time, an entire legacy art form has grown around all of this stuff. And so, of course, you've got to preserve it in like a museum way, but you've also got to think of it in a fresh, exciting new way. So it's like, I think, again, like orchestras are inherently pretty conservative organizations, just in the way they function. You've got 150 people in a room. There has to be some sense of consensus that, so there has to be a consensus that the chords can't be the most extreme, huge pauses or whatever. And if it's in the theatre, it's a different context. So what I kind of find really interesting as the composer-conductor is that, I can work, if I'm doing, not that I've had many opportunities to redo works, but like Orpheus, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about later, is a good example where I've done it. I've workshop sections. I've done a performance in Melbourne and then a performance in the United States. Going to the United States, the previous version was written for friends and colleagues, and I wrote it to be, my trombonist in my ensemble plays the sackbut. So I was like, sure, I'm going to write a sackbut part. We can't afford percussion. So again, we have a bass drum and some paper. There's the percussion section done. Well, then when I go to Texas to do it, we're working out of the university. Oh, we can have this and that and all these percussion equipment and all this and all that. But also the limitations of the musicians is different. So, harp parts were changed. I rewrote an entire instrument part the day before the show. It's much more akin to what people might have in their minds when you think about, like, we're going to put on a show, put on the theatre. Like you read the stories like Stephen Sondheim, where you had to rewrite a song the day before. It's much more akin to that, but the legacy we have of the canon has kind of lost a lot of the spontaneity, and so I that's what really excites me about making new music, and especially chamber music, is that and working with composers where you can just be like, this doesn't work. I'm sorry, this doesn't work. You got to change it. So another ensemble might be able to do it better. Another conductor might be able to do it better. We can't. The gig's tomorrow. What do you want to do? You do want to sound like crap, or do you want to sound good? So.
It's funny you should say that, because I think this is always one of the things that you find for people who aren't into classical music complain about is the lack of spontaneity, the lack of kind of interaction with audiences. You can't applaud, you can't do this, you can't do that, you've got to stay silent, you've got to sit down, you can't do and it makes it very difficult to get into music sometimes, and actually be part of it. And what I think is really good with a lot of modern stuff is that it enables you to interact more, which is kind of a goal, really, I think, because it does make this less stuffy. You see the more modern orchestras actually make it less stuffy, so it's kind of nice to hear that, I think.
And I mean, that is my guiding principle in the way I curate, the way that I put concerts together. My ensemble Forest Collective, the word interactive, the word you use there is like one of our guiding principles. And we actually, less so now, but we used to try and do performances that we called interactive chamber music, ways that you can walk right up to a musician, and that you can walk right up to a musician. You can wander, you can move through rooms, or we've had actors and theatre makers and dancers and all sorts of other aspects to change the mood or the focus of a show. But yeah, that's a big part of outside of my compositional practice is like, making, we say, clap whenever you want. Now, inevitably at a concert, no one does that in a classical music concert, because the music is so intense and it's so hardcore and it's like people don't want to interrupt all these things. But we try and encourage that spontaneity and warmth, and that there's no kind of like, oh, you don't realize it's the second movement, you don't clap between, and I've to excuse my French, but I have no time for that bullshit. Like, I just have no interest in that. And for anyone that kind of would correct somebody to, it's just like, but also that, that is a canon and tradition that can be honoured in other places, but it's not in my spaces. That's not something that is a priority.
But it's a canon and a tradition that can be honored that is also really not a part of the history of
No,
that music
no.
making in general. Like
Absolutely.
it's such a I have a very strong, and I as I always say on this podcast, like I'm preaching to the choir, but I realize that if when history comes time and we pull back, it will have been about like a 50, 75 year period where we had this idea where you had to be so stuffy and couldn't clap. And that, because prior to, I mean, if you were at any of the original performances of, I mean, pick a composer from prior to, let's say 1920, it was ruckus and you bumped into a musician and there was food and you were drunk and you were yelling at your friend across the way. And there was like this idea of like going to a concert in furs and pearls and tails is such a like
snobbery,
weird, strange thing. And, I appreciate the high camp of it. That's great. But it's such a tiny amount of time that we hopefully will have done that with classical music. And it's so nice to hear when people are making the next generation of classical music, because we have to move forward. We can't only program Beethoven forever. We have to keep moving. And when people are writing all this wonderful new stuff, that we've gotten rid of that idea of having to be so uptight and pretentious about everything, that, if something is funny, laugh. Like if there's an actor doing some like stupid thing on stage, laugh at them. They want to be laughed at. That's the point,
Yeah.
It's also like give the performers some warmth as well. Like it's something for me that like, there's such, if I've never really had, the concert hall orchestra, you walk in and they stand up and, of course that there's respect there and all that, but there's, when I do a Forest performance, the audience is right there and I have to go and close the door, tell the bar to stop serving drinks, dim the lights myself, say hello to my mum and then walk on stage. It's a much more interesting, enjoyable experience to me. Now that's again not to say like the Saturday Night Symphony or putting the pearls on to go to the opera. That's great, but like think about all the other opportunities that there are to experience the same music in different ways.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, a story that happened to me was that I like the ballet. I've always been a big ballet fan, and I used to go to the Royal Opera House, which is very stuffy. The Royal Opera House is all this kind, and people do a dance, and there may be a little ripple. It's kind of all like this. And then I was lucky to go to the Bolshoi in Russia, actually be there. This is some years ago, and they're shouting all the time. They're just out there shouting. If it's a great, let's applaud, and they'll do this for 20 minutes and make them do the dance 3 times, and this kind of thing until they're exhausted, this kind of stuff. And it's just part of the tradition, that if they've done something good, we're going to shout and we're going to raise our glasses and this kind of thing. So I think it's become a very stuffy, almost Northern European, almost, I guess, tradition of like, sort of maybe even Anglo-Saxon sort of tradition of like, of we've got to be very Victorian and be very upright and straight and this kind of thing. And that's kind of depressing and kind of boring, I think, anyway.
I always find it funny. I mean, as a musician, the more musicians the more you understand that is not how musicians function. They're like, when you actually know musicians, they're not above having a drink or having a good time or enjoying what they're playing in the moment, And then it's so funny that we present it that way, that, these very uppity, highly trained musicians are, it's not how we work, but
yeah,
totally.
Sorry, just because this comes in even. I mean, this is another thing that we started to talk about was queer music as well, and how even in a sense that's even more extreme for queer music to be fitted into this box of very rigid structures.
Absolutely.
And so that makes it even worse, if you know what I mean. In a sense, we're trying to fit something that is maybe joyous and different and all of that into a very formal, rigid structure, which is not what it's about or not how it should be.
Absolutely. And like, you're making commentary on life, right? So that's an inherently political thing. So what I was going to say before about like the audience reactions, I think as well from the three of us, our life experiences come from this colonial UK, British thing, like the way that people behave in Spain, for instance, or, the more Latin X countries is very different, even like going to the United States. In Australia, like, you want to get a standing ovation, like, you got to work bloody hard to make us lazy layabouts stand up and applaud. Well, when I was in America a few years ago, I was like, do I have to do another standing ovation? The standing ovations, like everything, every single. I was like, okay, it was good, but like, come on. So it's so interesting, these like different attitudes and perspectives, and I mean, to speak to the sort of the queer context, it's like, there is a performative, I think I always think of like the Oscar Wilde sort of history of that kind of like performative other, the drag queen, the sort of the freak, if you will, is often, a queer person questioning the status quo, and that's often looked upon perhaps in an academic way and a positive way, but also more often than not, as we know, in a really negative, laughing clown jester like thing. And so as a conductor, like, where I'm in a position of authority, but obviously I'm a human being who second guesses myself, there's often an element of that, of the performative aspect of being a person who has to stand in front of 100 people and tell them how to interpret the music. Even if I'm the composer of that music, that's, there's 1,000 more years of experience in front of me than I have about playing the violin, and the audacity of me to rebow something, a Beethoven symphony, or to come in and write a thing and say, do this, when I don't have an innate understanding of the violin. I'm always sort of aware of that. But luckily, I think the world has changed, where a lot of those roles were either, as I said, sort of comical or tyrants. I think of Mahler a lot, this like tyrannical kind of awful, firing people on the spot and telling the back section of the second violins to play without the rest of the orchestra, all this sort of stuff. You just can't do that now. Like contemporary HR doesn't allow that anymore, thankfully. So that's sort of, progressive world has helped in some ways, but still, there's a performative aspect to what we do as musicians, and especially as queer musicians.
So maybe thinking about performative queer arts and queer musicians, we should maybe switch to Orpheus. So this production is really interesting. If I have my ducks in a row, tell us about the actual like performance and the actual production, and where this version comes from.
Yeah. So this is my so far magnum opus, I would say, which is in itself, I hate, that kind of crap. I think that's going back to our conversation before, that's part of the problem of this sort of, it's the greatest thing I've ever written. But it's certainly the largest thing I've written. It's the largest, like, continuous piece of music. So it's what I call a dance opera. Here in my Australian accent, dance opera. I staged the work in its entirety in 2019 with my company Forest Collective in Melbourne, and then I took it to the United States with a company in Texas, in Austin, Texas. But prior to that, it contains a lot of previous works that were tester pieces for this sort of large-scale work, which is actually originally conceived as I love this idea of like blurring the traditional genres. So it was conceived as like a symphony that was operatic. So the idea that it could be a flexible work. So within the work itself, it explores kind of what an opera is, what an oratorio is, what chamber music is and isn't, and what like a symphony is and isn't. So just on a kind of sort of base level, there are times when the singers are singing very verismo, oh, woe is me, I am so sad, blah, blah, blah. Very, in that operatic tradition. But then there are times where the characters are used as instruments. There are times where the three singers have to use paper. So this paper thing returns and there's rustling of paper and and rocks. They play rocks at one point. They groan and growl in ways that are not necessarily to do with the character, they're to do with the musical thing. So I love this idea of, again, switching the performative roles that you're expecting. The singer at 1 minute is Eurydice, the next minute she's a different character, then she's playing some rocks, then she walks over here and fiddles with some paper. There's aspects to it that sort of come from the tradition of orchestral, the orchestral world. And, this idea of the audience using their imagination for letting the music sort of create something. So there's that aspect to it. Then there's the Greek myth and the actual story of Orpheus. So the work is for 3 singers and 3 dancers when staged with the dancers. Orpheus, Eurydice, and a character called Callis. So everyone knows, Monteverdi's L'Orfeo. A lot of people know Gluck's Orpheus and Eurydice. Like, there's umpty-doo versions of them. The Muppets have done Orpheus. It's a very common theme. And I will say, the Muppets, it's on YouTube. If you watch the Jim Henson versions from the 80s, it's like Dark Crystal. It's amazing. It's really, really incredible. And was actually very influential on the piece. But so we know this story of, the great musician with his lover. She, in one version, gets bitten by an asp. In other versions, she is chased by a satyr and is sexually abused and eventually dies. And that Orpheus then journeys to the underworld because he's so distraught, and he pleads his case to Hades, and Hades allows her to return to Earth on the one condition that when he's walking back up to the real world, he cannot turn around. And of course, Orpheus doesn't know if she's there or not, turns around, and she gets sucked back down. Everyone knows that myth. What we don't necessarily know is that the history of padastery in ancient Greece, this thing where a man would have a young boy in a sexual relationship, but also, it served a very different social construct to what we would understand today. And basically this young boy would be a mentee, if you will, both sexually, socially, economically, all these things. And of course, it was a man of social status that was allowed access to this privilege. And that young boy would be his property, essentially, until the young boy had a beard, at which point that boy would then, the cycle would change if that boy was an aristocrat or, high social standing, not a slave or whatever. Orpheus had this relationship with Callis, so that's the Callis role. So I bookend, the work is in 4 parts. The first part deals with Orpheus when he was on the boat with Jason and the Argonauts, and he saves them from the Sirens. So I wrote a work for string quartet called Sirens, which is the foundation of that section. They sing a love duet. The second part deals with Eurydice and her wedding day and this interaction with the satyr. Then the third section deals with the underworld, the journey to the exploration of the dealings with Hades. And then the fourth part, in classic ancient Greek style, he leaves the underworld. He goes, well, bugger her. I'll try and find Callis. He can't find Callis. And all these women in this wild, orgiastic thing, pissed off that Orpheus doesn't want to join in on their frivolity, so they rip his head off. It sails down the Euphrates and becomes a star. Zeus puts it in the sky as a star. So that's the crux of the piece. So a big part of it, sorry to just keep blabbering on about, but this work has sort of inhabited so much of my life. A big part of the piece is the role of Eurydice, the role of women in opera, the oppression of women, me as a man, a white man, cis man, telling a woman to die twice. She dies twice. Eurydice dies twice. She's just brought back and then dies again. Mimi dies an awful death. Violetta dies these awful deaths that these women have to face and sing in these roles, and the misogyny and the stereotypical kind of thing that female identifying opera singers have to deal with. So a big part of it for me was just questioning that and acknowledging that, and sort of saying, well, give her the contemporary voice that she doesn't get in Gluck or Monteverdi, and do it with those words. So I took the librettos of those operas, and all the words that Eurydice sings in the piece are her words in history, but hopefully in a way that gives her a modern power and allows that performer to give her, a little less of the woe is me waif, and hopefully empowers that person to interpret her in a way that, and empowers them to interpret her in a modern way, I guess.
I mean, so like you alluded to, there's been so many tellings of this story, and it's I think most people have in their mind like a version of maybe Eurydice's death that they hear and how they interpret this. And so then this version to me, as I was listening to it, it's so extended in its rawness. Maybe is a. I was listening to it and I just kept thinking, because there's this long period where we're kind of oscillating between two notes with these long breaks, and it's so filled with heavy angst and sadness, and but like raw emotional feel to it. And I think part of it is the physicality of the voice, that the singer is actually like putting in some of that grit to it. She has an amazing voice, but like there's a bit of that grit in the sound, but also the extended, like you never let us feel that cadence. It's just keeps in that space. And so what, I mean, obviously I'm assuming that was intentional, but like what were your thoughts when you were writing it for that part specifically, that beginning bit of...
Yeah. It's actually interesting because what I was saying before about how I write and it being a reasonably planned thing where I spend months thinking about something before I put pen to paper, this was actually to use a nice Greek term, a eureka moment where I just went, that is what it is. That is what the death is. And I pulled a piece of manuscript out and just wrote it. So to give the section context, the aria context, is that what's preceded it is a very long passage of instrumental music that depicts the chase by the satyr and the kind of graphic sexual assault that the satyr performs to her. So in the dance version, that is obviously danced, and in that section, it's full ensemble. It's wild. It's raucous. There's lots of color, grumbling, really quite violent sounds, and then out of that, you come to this. I'm not going to say static, but singular voice. You know, I love this idea that you have that climax and then you have this single voice. The idea musically was that she's died, and what you hear in the aria is the breath leaving her body. So what we're witnessing in the aria is both literally her dying, but it's also the abstract kind of idea of her soul moving into that other realm where Hades takes over. You hear that at the end, the bass drum, that happens throughout the work. Basically, the bass drum plays pretty much from the beginning of the piece to the end with this rumble, so that there's always a heartbeat, or there's always something, however you want to depict it, the universe, whatever it is, and it's just this fantastic sound, the bass drum in an acoustic space. I could listen to it for hours. Grisey has this fantastic piece for 2 bass drums. It goes for like 10 minutes. It's just people scraping, but it's really cool. And anyway, I was obsessed with bass drums. So it's the only point of the piece, I think, where there's no continuous bass drum. So you hear the bass drum at the end, the 3 strikes is kind of a literal, her heart has stopped beating. But it's also, the kind of knocking of fate, all those kind of things. So, and the pitch material, the F sharp to G, da, 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 that is like all the way through the piece. And the whole opera is constructed, I actually have it, not that we're talking on video, so it's not really going to matter for our friends on radio, but I still have it on my computer. I have this like little scrap of manuscript. That is the opera. In those 5 chords, that is the entire opera. So what it is it's an E minor chord, for those playing at home, an E minor chord, a small cluster based around D sharp, E natural, and F sharp, another cluster on E, F, and G, and then a G sharp and a G natural, and an F sharp with a F natural and a D natural. Anyway, the movement between E minor, E major, between G, the clash between G sharp and G natural is peppered through the entire work, and that represents. It's very literal. It's E minor for Orpheus, E major for Eurydice, and then there's this D major minor thing for Callis, this sort of weak sound for Callis, because he's sort of in a vulnerable position. So the F sharp to G, the G to G sharp thing, it's all kind of based on really traditional harmony, this kind of a blurring between a major and a minor, happy, sad, male, female. It's this establishes a binary, but also mushing them together to create to make the ground sort of shake underneath it. So that's the sort of thinking behind the aria. Did that answer your question?
It did, and I also am always very interested to see scores, so that's really interesting to me as well. And I was I'm condensing, so like this is maybe not like a useful conversation, and maybe this is like you and I have a conversation sometime, but like so. You never play, or not never play, but like in the reduction, there's no C sharp, B flat, but everything else is covered. If you have a D major, there's an A, but there's a G sharp, G, F sharp, F, E, D flat, E flat, D sharp, D. Yeah. And so like another day, why the C sharp and C is left out? Like where is that in the?
I don't think that was as intent. I think it's probably a fluke. But what it does is that because Calice's world sits in this D major minor thing, but there's never the presence of the A. So if you're talking real specific, sorry to those who perhaps are listening for the pure love of talking about music than the mechanics. But, if you have a major chord or a minor chord, it's the third that determines the nature of that. But if you remove the fifth, it's more abstract than if you have the fifth. So if you have the fundamental, so D and A, that's going to sound more, well, to me anyway, it sounds more consonant. And in traditional harmony practice, it's deemed to be more, functional, whatever. It's the third that determines the character. So by removing that from Calice, his world is very weak. It doesn't have a sense of D major. While the worlds of Eurydice and Orpheus, and particularly at the end of the opera, there's this section where I really try to create a world that has both E major and minor coexisting in a way that is less static, less abstract. It always has the fifth, so you can always, in the harmony, give it a sense of grounding. Calice's world doesn't have that because he's a young boy at the beck and call of another person. Eurydice has her own power. Orpheus has his own power. So, but I think that's a fluke. I think that was just a decision to create an unstable sound world for Calice, and it was just sort of a natural thing to remove the fifth.
But a good explanation, even if on the fly and unintentional.
And I'll give you a good a reference where I got this from. So I'm obsessed with this E major minor thing. It's in I'm going to say 80% of my music is this, and Orpheus is like a treatise in it, and it is the opening to the Titanic musical by Maury Eston. So if you're a music theatre nerd, go and listen to the opening, and that has always obsessed me. So this is another aspect of my music, is that I love Western art music and classical music, but I also love musical theatre. So there's also elements that you're always drawing upon many different areas. Yeah.
A little while ago, Jacob mentioned this raw feeling, and we never talked about your music before this, but I wrote down almost exactly the same words. I put down very bare and raw in places that for me gave a very sense of combination of unease sometimes, and I guess what have you talked about changing between the majors and minors is part of this. So it was almost like it never settled. You were always being thrown off slightly. You thought it was going to resolve. I guess I'd use the word resolve. I don't know if that's right, but you felt like it, but then you were pulled off into a different space that didn't resolve, and then you were brought back again. And it was only right at the end that you felt that you got some kind of conclusion to it. And I guess that's what you're talking about, where you put this mishmash together, because until then you're always being between one space and another, and maybe this third space, which I probably did here as well, but these different spaces. So it's kind of interesting that we picked up on that sort of rawness and I guess fluidity. I don't know if that's the right word, but
it's interesting you say that, because the character of Orpheus inherently is very lost in this piece. Like, he spends most of the time in the opera going, where is it?
Where is she? Where is she?
Where is she? Yeah, Khalees is gone, and we're going to get the sirens. Like, he's just this, like, the Eurydice is the more sensible one of the two. Like, he spends all this time like, woe is me, and I've lost her, and he's like, and that's at the core of the work. You don't get the satisfaction harmonically until he's dead, because he doesn't have that satisfaction. He's wandering the world, and it's just interesting that is also an element in my first opera, Calypso, where the character of Calypso it's also based on a section from the Odyssey, and she has a very similar character in that way, which doesn't know what she's going to do, and she's really like questioning the whole thing, and she's like, on the one hand, making decisions as an individual, but also this sense of fate and the gods and the universe and blah blah blah. So this kind of and I guess that's, inherent in my character, perhaps, this sort of unease and friction of trying to sort of get through the adversity to something else. So it's cool to know that it comes across.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the show tunes bit. One of the other things I wrote down is I'd like to see this as a show, because it came across to me that it was more than just the music when I listened to it. It had a feeling of like, I needed to see it. I needed to see what was happening, not only to understand it, I think, in terms of what the musicians were doing, but it felt to me like it was a piece of theatre as well. So that kind of came over in the music, and now I can see the showman bit behind this, that's sort of driving that.
I'll send through to you both, and maybe it could be added to the show notes or something, both an amazing image from the original production, and I've also got a short video that has the choreography in it, because that's Ashley Dugan. Yeah. Shout out to him. He was the choreographer and danced the role of Orpheus, and he creates incredible work. Really, there's a abstraction in contemporary dance that I love, and that was a huge element of this. But in this section, Kate Bright, who isn't singing it on this recording, unfortunately, but sang it in the original, she memorized the whole work, which as a composer is like such a privilege when a musician does that. And she memorized this section's really hard, and it's 2 notes, which sounds easy. It's not. If you're a singer, trying to maintain that poise is incredibly difficult. Anyway, she is in the performance was moving around the space and, trying to characterize this feeling of the soul leaving her body. And the dancer, she had this idea, and we incorporated it into the show, where her dance self, the other Eurydice, Pia, walked on stage, comes up behind her, and there's a section where Eurydice needs to cover her mouth to sing, which feeds into this element around the exploration of the sexual abuse and, this, so trigger warnings about, again, for many female characters in opera and classical antiquity, this element of rape and abuse. She has to muffle her sound with her hands, the singer. So we got the dancer to do it. So it was this incredibly poetic moment where the physical self, the vocal self, all these things came together in this amazing moment. And the image for it is just so powerful. Incredibly intimate, and changes the character for that muffled section of the aria.
I would love to see this someday. You're never bringing it to the East Coast of Canada, but maybe I'll bring it to the East Coast of Canada for you. But I would love to see it.
Give me $4 million. It's yours.
Yeah, come on. We've got plenty of money. We've got we got a podcast. That must be fun.
But as like a concert programmer and a conductor, I am such a fan of making all parties sit with the emotion so actively, like for audience, for performers, for the musicians themselves. I love the idea of, and this is why I think like that extended rawness between those 2 notes is so compelling to me, is that I am never, if we don't do it to the nth degree, what's the point? If we don't do something in full, why bother? If you have dancers and they just kind of dance a bit, what was the point of having dancers? It has to be like such an integral,
Yeah.
immediate part of anything. And so similarly, when, you have something, you write something like Eurydice's death, and you only go 60%. Well, that was useless. You got to go 100. Make people sit with it. Make people sit with those two notes. Make the performer sit with those two notes, and have that struggle. I mean, we talk about it all the time in like performance world about, it's the classic example always used is the beginning. We were talking about Stravinsky earlier, but the beginning of the Rite of Spring for the bassoon, that like high pitch is in extreme, but make the performer sit with that. Make the performer sit with those two notes and make them do it over and over and over, and keep that composure, and hear the degradation in that composure. Hear that that rawness kind of seep in. It's really a fascinating place to sit with for everybody.
What I would also say to that is, to like any young artists or fresh kids out there, what also is really excellent with that is that it's also so much to do with practicalities for me. So it's like, again, like the tin cans. It creates this violent, uncomfortable sound. The two notes creates this, incredibly uncomfortable sound, but it's actually a very easy, straightforward thing. I've given the singer two notes. So there's a lot less. I mean, that has its own practical problems, but just from like learning new music as a singer is incredibly difficult. And in the original production, they sang with the score, and again, the dance opera element was that it's just made more sense. The dancers do all the physical work, and the singers do all the emotive vocal work. So there's in that you can create incredible moments with for instance with when Pia would cover the hands over Kate, these incredible images, but there's also practical things. So you can tease out of your limitations, especially when you have no money and time, and out of that you can tease extremities or whatever it is, and create some really amazing moments like that from the scraps.
But this is kind of it's partly kind of a metaphor for life, isn't it? It's no point living in the middle here. You might as well live at the extremes, because that's where all the interesting shit is, if you excuse my language. But that's where the fun stuff is. And also, you mentioned about, the fact that using tin cans, this kind of thing. One of the big things I always hear about classical music when talking to my friends is that it's unapproachable, it's too expensive, it's too difficult, it's da-da-da-da-da. You can rattle off a list of things, because you've got to buy a $500 violin, or you've got to buy this, that, or the other, and you've got to go to 400 lessons, and then you've got 10,000 hours, and then you might be good in, as opposed to the sort of more popular music, as we might say, where you can go and thrash it out. And so, what I quite like about the tin cans in this is that anybody can do that.
Yes.
Anybody can pick that up and do that and make some music by doing something simple. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have all this stuff and to be in this genre of sort of poshness or whatever you want to call it, to actually make good classical or avant-garde or whatever you want to call it music.
Yeah, and that's, in Orpheus, the singers have to scrunch paper and plastic bottles, and that element to it is that, anyone could just pick up that. And they're not percussionists, they're singers, and so more often than not, they got it wrong. And that's fine. Like, that's kind of part of the charm. That's also, part of the aspect of humans doing music, that element of noodling that is so prevalent in folk music or pop music, which, think of every 15-year-old picking up a guitar for the first time. Like, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I work in a very heightened world, but trying to bring that spontaneity again into it, and empowering classical musicians to, perhaps part of my music, there is elements of improvisation and not a huge amount, but there is certainly times of aleatoricism, if you will. And that, again, it's about empowering those musicians to make choices. And inherently, when you do that, they love it. They love it. They get the opportunity to contribute something above and beyond the vision of the composer. And that's something that's, again, like we said before, if Mozart or Beethoven, if we were doing Magic Flute now, I'm sure Mozart would be like, get a DJ, We'll just get DJs to do it. Like, why would we have a whole orchestra there? We don't have any money. You know, there would be practical considerations made for those reasons.
I mean, I think we're probably all on the same page here, but there is this kind of, seem to be less precious about the past than a lot of people. And I think that's kind of do you think that's a queer thing? I mean, I'm just curious here whether this is because, with all the challenges that we have in life, do we see this as part of that, is questioning these things, and saying, is this real, or is it just what's been imposed upon us by the structure of whatever?
I think that, like, we're so lucky. Like, I love the idea that, like, we're our own club, and we get to access this slither of history that informs, like, and empowers. And I think that, like, for me, again, the Greek thing, it's like the awful, like, industrialized world was inherently conservative. You think of, like, Britain in the late 1800s, post-war period, Eisenhower, all that kind of stuff, inherently really, nuclear family, blah, blah, blah. But there was a time where a man like Orpheus had a wife, had a boy on the side, was in orgies, did all these other things, and is still held on a pedestal, but people don't know that. And I just love that, like, idea that we also are special and have access as queer people to this, like, whole undercurrent of culture. So I don't know. I'm not straight, so I don't know if the other side doesn't. But, like, in my experience, history and questioning of gender and identity and all these things, it's the gig. It's what you're doing every day. So there's a knowledge there that you have to learn or acknowledge. Yeah.
I mean, it's quite a lot of history of I guess what would be called white cis heteronormative society, eradicating queerness out of, like, cultures like India and anywhere the colonies went. They just eradicated any sort of queerness and just made it, as you say, these Victorian mill, the old ancient dark satanic mills type thing.
Yes.
So yeah, absolutely,
yeah.
Thanks again for listening to the Classical Queer Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the music and conversation. We're looking forward to bringing you the next podcast soon. Also, many thanks to Jared Miller for all the incidental music we are using. Until next time.